Asia Resource Action Center. And I'm going to be joined today with our immigration policy intern, Kathy Tran, who will be providing technical assistance support. So as many of you on the phone are aware, a number of people in the Southeast Asian American community have been impacted by the recent roundups by ICE targeting Cambodian and Vietnamese people in the past month. SEARAC and partners at the Asian Law Caucus and Viet Lead, among many others, have been working together to conduct intake and provide resources to families whose loved ones have been targeted. Due to the volume of requests for support, SEARAC decided to put together this webinar to share resources for families who want to know what they can proactively do in addition to any legal support that they are already getting. The agenda for today's call will cover the following topics. Updates. There's been a lot of movement since the roundups began in October, and we'll be giving a brief overview on why these detentions are happening and why they are particularly troubling. Speaker intros. Today we're joined by advocates, legal experts, and directly impacted people and family members who have had experience fighting deportation orders. They will be sharing advice, and we encourage you to ask them questions towards the end of the presentation as well. Then we'll move on to Advocacy 101, and this is really going to be the bulk of our presentation. For families and organizations wanting to know what other things folks can do to fight outside of the legal space, we'll be reviewing key components of advocacy with our speakers giving tips from their past personal experiences. And then we'll move on to an analysis of the political climate, because while we recognize that advocacy is one of the things people can do to fight deportations, we also want to share an analysis of what the risks and opportunities are now under the Trump administration. And then we're going to save the rest of the webinar time for Q&A, as well as sharing a list of resources. I also wanted to note, since we have a very limited number of time, this webinar will focus on proactive advocacy techniques. While we will touch on some legal options and provide some updates, we encourage folks to seek specific legal assistance and updates to their specific cases offline. So before we get started, we wanted to do a quick poll to see who is on the phone today. So if folks could just, if you look on your webinar screen, we'll be bringing up a poll. And if folks could answer the question, the first question is, where are folks calling from? The Northeast, the Midwest, the South, the Pacific Northwest, or the West? And we'll give a few seconds for folks to answer that question. Great, thanks everyone for putting your responses. Let's close the poll and see what we have. So as folks can see, wow, 50% of those on the call are from the West, with a good chunk from the Pacific Northwest, followed by the Northeast and the Midwest and the South. For the second poll question, we wanted to get a sense, if folks on the call can answer, do you know someone directly impacted by the recent roundups in the Southeast Asian American community? And you should be seeing the question show up on your screen. Okay, we'll give a few folks a few more seconds to log in their answers. Okay, let's see what the results look like. So a majority of folks on the call are actually allies that don't know folks directly impacted, but are definitely here as allies that want to share resources with folks in their community. 24% know of a community member. 9% have a family member, and a small percent also of folks directly impacted themselves are joining the call today. Let's close that up. Okay. So many community members are confused as to why ICE is now suddenly detaining their loved ones after years of them peacefully checking in with their local field office without incident. Due to the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in the 70s, it's only more recently that the United States has restored diplomatic relationships with Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which has made it possible for these countries to begin accepting deportees back. Compared to other countries, Cambodia up until this point has accepted a limited number of people back a year, usually an average of about 30 to 40. In comparison, Vietnam until this point has accepted those who came to the US after 1995 for deportation. This was the year that the US and Vietnam restored diplomatic relations. Back in the summer, the deportee community in Cambodia successfully pushed the Cambodian government to stop issuing travel documents. But the US immediately retaliated by issuing sanctions on Cambodia, preventing high-ranking officials from obtaining US visas. And as a result, Cambodia started to agree to start issuing travel documents once again. And for the Vietnamese community, there's been a lot of fear and concern that the US will pressure Vietnam into changing their policy to allow for the deportations of more people, including those that came to the US prior to 1995. So, why is this roundup particularly troubling? One reason is because it is one of the biggest roundups we've seen in recent history in the Southeast Asian American community. Cambodia announced earlier this year that it would be issuing 26 travel documents, but we're seeing a roundup of more than 100 people being detained by ICE. In addition, for Vietnam, there's been a lot of confusion because we've been seeing the detention of a number of people that came prior to 1995 being detained. And if you look at, we additionally found out as well that US has submitted 95 names to Vietnam to be considered for deportation. And this is almost triple the number of people that were deported back to Vietnam last year. So last year, there were about 35 people that were deported back to Vietnam. So knowing that 95 names have been submitted at this point is particularly troubling. And lastly, the Trump administration has made it clear that he prioritizes the removal of those with criminal convictions, regardless of the background, refugee status, and US ties. Under the prior administration under Obama, there was a directive that ICE would prioritize their limited resources in pursuing the detention of those who pose a clear threat to public safety. But this administration has essentially abolished those safety mechanisms and has encouraged ICE to try and deport as many people as possible. While the current situation is indeed uncertain and terrifying, we want to tell the community not to lose hope. There are a number of tools and tactics families and communities can do to try and fight with what is happening to their loved ones. Our speaker today will be talking about these resources and sharing their own personal experiences in fighting their deportation cases. So I wanted to introduce our speakers briefly. Today we're going to be joined first by Jenny Shrey. She is one of the main organizers of the Release Minnesota A campaign, which is a national campaign that was launched last year that saw to the release of 3 Cambodian Americans from detention and ultimately freedom from deportation. And one of the individuals that ended up being saved was Jenny's husband, Ched. Our next speaker will be Anoop Prasad of the Asian Law Caucus. Anoop has been on the ground supporting families, providing legal intake and legal advice, and his organization led the efforts in filing the class action lawsuit challenging the detention of Cambodian Americans a few weeks ago. And then lastly, we have Eddie Zhang, who is co-director of the Asian Prisoner Support Committee. Eddie is a directly impacted individual himself, and he actually successfully was able to win a governor's pardon from the governor of California, and just last year was able to successfully naturalize to become a US citizen. So we welcome each of these speakers. And actually, before we get started, I wanted to invite Jenny and Eddie, if you guys wanted to share a little bit more of your background and story, and also if you guys have any words of encouragement for families on the phone that might be a little scared about currently what's happening in the community. Jenny, did you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm on this call because like Katrina said, I'm directly impacted and have gone through a lot of what people are experiencing right now. But Release Minnesota, we're still fighting. Like, our families still have other things that we need to do to keep us safe. And so we also here to offer support where we can. But I guess one of the pieces of encouragement is that this is possible. Like, Release Minnesota 8 families and supporters were really active and really involved in their loved ones' cases. And while it was really hard, it was possible. And there are a lot of great people out there who are willing to support and help.
Thank you, Jenny. Eddie, did you want to go next?
Yes, Happy New Breath, everyone. Eddie Zhang here. I'm glad that we're coming together on this because, in order for us to be able to fight any type of social injustice issues, that we have to come together as a community. And so for myself, I was a juvenile lifer, meaning that I committed a crime of kidnapping, commit robbery at the age of 16 as an immigrant. And I ended up spending 19 years in the prison system. And then I was able to get released after 19 years. But then I was immediately detained for deportation because I wasn't a citizen of the United States. And I spent 2 years in ICE detention fighting my case. And I lost my case, even though I had tremendous support from the community. However, because the Chinese government did not issue a travel document for me, they released me on the intensive supervision appearance program, which I had to first being put on an ankle monitor and to check in 3 times a week, until later on I was able to post bail and only had to check in every 6 months. And during that process, I still appealed my case in the Ninth Circuit Courts, and I ended up winning at the Ninth Circuit Courts, and my case was sent back to immigration judge. Right around the time during the litigation, I was able to successfully, with the help of the community and advocates, to get a pardon from Governor Jerry Brown in California. And after the pardon, the Department of Homeland Security withdrew its case against me. So I became a legal permanent resident again. And then I was able to go back to San Francisco County, which is the county of my commitment, to do a post-conviction relief. And the DA agreed to vacate all my deportable charges. So after that, my wife, who's a citizen of the United States, applied for a petition for a visa for me to become a U.S. citizen. And in January of this year, I became a U.S. citizen. And so it was a lot of work, a lot of advocacy, and then the circumstances revolve around case has a lot to do with it. So one of the, for me is, people have counted me out. There's no way that someone that who committed an aggravated felony or violent crime that was able to get relief and also become a citizen of the United States. So even though every individual case is different, but then, we don't know what kind of relief that we have until we actually understand each of the individual cases and the family and the impacts in the community. So the encouraging trajectory is that, there are many options that we can do to help keep our family intact. But sometimes that action has to do with all of us coming together and really being active in supporting some of the community-based organizations and advocates in our community to be able to push policy to make changes, right? So it is possible when we come together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Eddie, for your inspiring stories and your words of wisdom. I really think that those on the call will have so much to learn from your experience. We've started to actually get a few questions from folks, and we do encourage folks to type their questions in as our presenters present, but in order to make sure that we do get through our presentation, we'll make sure to save the Q&A for the end. So as we mentioned, we've been speaking to many families who want to do as much as they can to help their loved ones, similarly to what Jenny and Eddie have done, but outside of getting legal support, they don't really know what else to do. So while SEARAC encourages folks to consider fighting their case through advocacy, this conversation will really focus on what does this really look like and what does it really entail. So one of the first major components of advocacy is local mobilization or organizing. Simply put, this is the process of bringing your local community together to organize actions and other activities to support you or your loved one's case. Its aims are typically to educate, to empower, and to drive action. And I'd like to invite Jenny and Eddie to share out briefly a couple of things. If you guys could just basically share how one would go about doing outreach in their community, like what were specific steps that you took to do this? And if you could also share tips for effective mobilization to bring awareness on your deportation case, and also challenges you encountered, and how should you anticipate how to address them? And maybe Jenny, did you want to start first?
Sure. Okay. That's a lot. So one of the first things we did, and since 60% of you are people are trying to help, so one of the first things we did was really understand our legal case. So we had to sit down with a U of M professor who just basically went over different legal steps that we could take. And I mean, he was really great. He provided his number, email, we could call and ask him questions. And so just finding somebody who is willing to take your calls and answer these questions so you can really understand the legal case. And it's really important, and people have reached out and don't really know yet like exactly what their charges are, exactly what they're filing, and or how to look up that information. So one of the things, like, I was on the phone with somebody from a different state, and it takes a while to figure out how you look up records, because records are public. And so helping them through that process, and even somebody, like another person called and filed something, but they weren't exactly sure what they filed. And so I encourage them to like really go talk to a lawyer and make sure they understand exactly what they're filing, what the next steps they need to take are, you know, what's pending, all of that information. It's really important that you understand that. Another tip is get people involved, get support. You know, we as Minnesota 8, like we had a group of us. So a group of us were supporting each other, and then we were able to get outside support. And as a family member, the fight's really hard, and having people who support you really helps build your strength. There's a lot of work that's ahead, and it takes a pretty big toll on impacted family members. So one of the things we did is just kind of break up into teams, and like a logistic team, a media team, things like that to kind of help make things go smoother. Another really important piece in the beginning was to talk about our messaging, learn what people know and don't know, think about how you're going to educate people who don't know about this, because there are a lot of people who don't know that this is happening, a lot of congressional leaders, a lot of a lot of people in the community that don't know about this. So really having the message and being unified with that message and gathering that support was important. So, and then you asked about the challenges. There are a few different things that can happen when you're asking for people to get support. People can either say yes, and they'll help you. And those people, like in our experience, those people become our extended family. And there are others who are on the fence, and it takes work to get them to be on your side. So that's where the work is. And there are just some flat out no's. And a personal experience for me is like we were we were trying to get post-conviction relief for my husband, and it was like the day before Thanksgiving. It was right around the holidays, and I got a no, and you get a lot of no's and you get some yeses, and it was the hardest time for me, and being able to have a support network to help me get through that was important. The no's are very hard, and it just having people to tell you that no, there's still other things that we can do is important to keep the strength to keep fighting. So that was really quick, but
thank you for sharing, Jenny. Eddie, did you have anything to add as well?
Yes, I definitely is understanding your case. You know what is at stake. So it's always great to get the legal consultation if you can, to understand all your options. And once you understand the options, then it's easier for you to do strategically plan on how do you go about doing that. And so first thing, the only people that who will support you is your family members. So definitely connect with the family members and friends to get them to be able to kind of do a poll of understanding like who has what type of resources and who has what connection to, whether it's community-based organizations or allies or even politicians, because that's very important in getting more people on board in supporting the case or the cause, and then having the legal support to be able to understand whether when you're doing the messaging in uplifting the story, do you want to do it in the social media? Do you want to do it publicly doing the news outlets? So that's also an important deciding factor on some of the campaigns that people decide to do, because sometimes it could be good to have this type of public campaigns, but there's a government official who's willing to work on compromising some of the on the legal aspect of it, and sometimes the social media strategy may not be a good strategy. So those are something that people have to consider. I think other aspect of this community outreach is really, besides outreaching to the individual communities, but really is holding the politicians accountable by reaching out to your representatives, whether locally, nationally, or to get them to be able to get on board on the issue, because they're supposed to represent you. And then following up with people is very important, because nobody's going to feel the same urgency as you do as an impacted individual. So it's always good to be able to have either the family members who's always to like the central organizer of the case to really follow up with people, or you have to designate somebody to do it. Because when I was doing it, I was inside custody all the time. So they're up to a couple of the key supporters out there to be able to mobilize and organize everything for me. And then the other thing also with the challenging part is that it takes a mental toll on people, because the impacted individual and families, they feel the urgency, they feel those hopelessness sometimes. So they need to surround themselves with people who can provide them with the mental support, and then to continue to fight. And giving up really is not really an option. So that's just some of the kind of like overall in how to really build community. But we can talk a little bit more about the legal aspect of it later on, and I think Anoop is going to be able to provide a very valuable information.
Thank you, Eddie. So as both Jenny and Eddie mentioned, when it comes to mobilization and organizing, it's important to figure out who in your community you want to reach out to. And the idea of reaching out to so many people sometimes can be overwhelming. And as Jenny was saying, sometimes a lot of people will say no, but there are a few people that will say yes. So just some practical tips for folks is when you're mapping out who in your community to outreach to, kind of do an analysis of where you're active in your community. Are you involved in your school, in your local churches, in community groups? Who does your family interact with a lot? Who knows you the best? And who would you trust to support your campaign? And from there, you can branch out to possibly other advocacy organizations that are local, and then even branch out to maybe more national groups. That's sort of how, for example, Jenny and the Minnesota 8 came on SEARAC's radar. I know they did a lot of local outreach, and one of our partners out in Minnesota ended up flagging their case for us, and then, you know, we ended up connecting with Jenny. So I think making sure to figure out who your allies are locally, and then branching out from there. And another thing that Eddie and Jenny talked a lot about was clarifying, well, one is the legal aspects of your case and having a clear understanding of that. But then also when you're mobilizing locally, trying to understand what your purpose of mobilization is, what your specific asks are, and who your targets are. So, you know, are you targeting your member of Congress? Are you targeting the local media? Are you targeting ICE? And figuring out what your message is depending on your audience. And then another piece as well is, you know, mobilizing a local campaign takes a lot of work. And as both Jenny and Eddie mentioned, it could also take a lot of emotional toll on you, especially if you are the impacted person or if you're a family member of the impacted person. So make sure that you lean on your networks, you lean on others in your community, and don't be afraid to ask help and to delegate. And just remember that there is a supportive community out there that's willing to step up for you. It's just a matter of finding those people. And then lastly was a point that Eddie emphasized is the need to follow up. So as Jenny was saying, oftentimes you'll get a no, but sometimes you just need to keep hounding people. You need to keep asking them over and over and over again, and with the hopes of turning that no into a yes. And we'll talk about that a little more when we talk about congressional outreach, but that's definitely a technique that goes across all the different factors of organizing and advocacy. So for the next piece, we wanted to talk a little bit about the role of media, which is another essential component of advocacy. Media outreach or media itself is usually a tool for community education. So, you know, as Jenny was mentioning, a lot of people may not know about what's happening around these deportations. So it'll help create awareness. And it's also used as a public shaming tool if you want to basically pressure certain targets to act in a certain way you want. So for example, shaming ICE or the administration for detaining family and loved ones. So with that, I wanted to hand it over back to Jenny and Eddie to share out their experiences with dealing with the media by answering a couple of questions. So first, you know, how did you guys go about outreaching to the media? And then what advice would you give to families that are afraid to talk about, you know, basically their private business? You know, what if media asks them personal questions? How do you guys go about answering that? And then lastly, if you have any advice or if you have any personal experiences to share with regards to unfriendly media outlets and public scrutiny and how you basically dealt with those challenges. And maybe with this question, we can start with Eddie first.
Yes, I think the media could very much be your friend or be your enemy in this type of thing. So it all depends on when you reach out to the media. Is something that is it the media person or the outlet is something that you or your organizer are familiar with, right? If you have a sympathetic media, then they will ask you the question to help you support your cause. But if you have media just to go out there to report news and it's biased, sometimes it could be harmful to the campaign. And so to reach out to the media has to be, you know, you have to have some sort of relationship through your network or through people to understand who are the people that you want to reach out to. And then as far as handling personal sensitive questions, you know, it all depends on, you know, what message, right? That we talk about the importance of the messaging. It's like, what message do you want to portray out there? Because every time that you put out to the media, whatever you share with the media, unless it's live, it's not necessarily it's going to be the message that you want to portray, because they do a lot of editing on what you say. So sometimes without context, the public will see it to get a different message than the message you want to convey. So it's important for you to stick with actually what you have a scripted message that you want to put forth to the media. So if you get caught, you know, somebody just get caught with the media just unexpectedly, you know, then the best thing is just not say too much, right? Don't feel the need to just provide more information that is needed. And then you can always say no, or you can always don't answer, right? And then with unfriendly media, definitely is just pretty much you have to know that whatever your message is, you stick with that, and don't let the media trying to hound you and keep asking you questions that you do not want to answer. And when you keep sticking to the message, then there's nothing else they can get from. So for me, my media attention throughout my whole campaign has been, negative and positive in some ways, but then I have more positive, sympathetic media than negative ones. So I feel that it could be definitely a good advocacy tool if we use appropriately.
Great, thank you so much, Eddie. Jenny, did you have anything to add as well?
Yeah. Well, just echoing what Eddie said, is like really get to know who the media is. So like what we do is like we ask, what's their intention of this article. We ask them to send us pieces that they've written. We look at their platform to see what type of articles they've had on the issue. And a lot of our media that we've had were sort of linked to some type of action. So if we had a hearing coming up, we'd talk to the local paper. Like, for instance, with my husband's case, he had that post-conviction hearing in the county that we grew up in. So we talked to the people. We knew somebody who knew somebody at the local paper. So that's how, like, we tried to find the right person. So like there was, I think an NPR article, like video came out too, like right before the hearing, and so like our job with that was to humanize our loved ones, and our message was to talk about who our my husband was to our family. So so a lot of our media that we did was attached to some type of action we had. We did do, like, the photo that you had up was our Not Home for the Holidays rally, which we delivered holiday cards to ICE. And then there was another ICE Monster rally, which was right around Halloween. And so those are sort of these actions that we had, and we created press releases, and then like we're asking media to come out to, and these are messages that, like, these actions have very clear messages that we worked with a lot of people to help us with these actions. So that's sort of, that we had a message with each action that we were consistent with, like Eddie said, with the media. And like people, I think you had a question about people fearing, like, like a criminal record is public record. So people can get that information. And I've had a couple times where I didn't like the article, and I spoke directly to the writer. So don't be afraid, like, to talk to the journalists. Like, they are on your time. Like, when you're ready to talk to them, you talk to them. Like, just make sure that you're the one in charge. You're the one that they want the story from. So if you can't talk to them, don't talk to them. If you want to talk to them in a couple of days, that's what you should do. So do what you're comfortable with.
Great, thank you so much, Jenny and Eddie. And I really love that we ended with that tip from you, Jenny. And it's important to also, again, yes, reiterate that, media is here to support your case, but at the end of the day, it is your story, it is your campaign, and you basically control when you're ready to do it. And I know that speaking to media is always not the easiest to do. So thank you both for your tips. I just wanted to summarize a few practical tools and tips with regards to dealing with the media as well. So oftentimes with the media, if there's a story happening at the moment, well, right now, for example, with the Roundups, they often work on short deadlines. So if you are very committed to speaking to the media and doing public outreach, just to always remember to be responsive, since media usually does work on very tight deadlines. Another piece as well, which goes back to figuring out your messaging that Jenny and Eddie were talking about earlier, is just making sure that you practice your pitch. You basically know your story and you practice being both concise and accurate. Another piece, Jenny touched on it as well, is don't be afraid to review articles that are published about you or your loved ones, making sure that it's accurate and making sure that your loved one is being portrayed in the way that you want them to be portrayed. And additionally, make sure that when you do talk to the media and there are stories written up about you or your loved one, that you share it broadly. Make sure you share it with the community, and more importantly, share it with members of Congress. Oftentimes, members of Congress are hesitant to act or really do anything until they're seeing the media writing up stories on what's happening, because at that point, they know that the public is paying attention. And then lastly, Jenny touched on this as well, that the media can be your allies too. I know it's daunting to speak to them, but if locally, you're organizing actions to support the campaign of your loved one, don't be afraid to reach out to media to cover your story. Especially right now, there's just a lot of attention on these Southeast Asian American detentions, that a lot of news outlets are very interested, specifically with talking with directly impacted folks. And I think with the number of you I've emailed, oftentimes when we get media inquiries, I usually email it to families I've been in touch with to see if they'd be willing to speak to them. And oftentimes, and I just wanted to reiterate, of course, Jenny's tip as well about not being afraid to research these media outlets, seeing what articles they published in the past. Oftentimes, media that comes to SEARAC is through our network. So for the most part, they're friendly media outlets, but that's definitely something to be aware of as well. So lastly, we want to touch next on, I would say, one of the most powerful steps in advocacy, which is reaching out to your elected officials. Congress has the power to change laws and also influence administrative action, which includes deportation. Not only that, but they are accountable to their voting constituents, which are you. Jenny and Eddie, can you talk a little bit about your experience with congressional advocacy by sharing basically tips on how you went about requesting a meeting? How did you go about making sure that these offices listen to your demands? And what are concrete things that people can even ask for help on? And if you have general tips on any challenges that you had in terms of congressional outreach. And maybe with this question, we can start with Jenny again.
Okay. So yeah, there are in the beginning, we just contacted offices, and there usually are immigration workers within each office that you can connect with, and they're supposed to have more knowledge on issues around immigration. Well, I guess one of the things is to get the attention of the officials. So one of our officials, actually, we got their attention, and they called us into a meeting with them. It was the first congressional leader that we actually got to meet face to face. Representative Keith Ellison, I guess, is a plug for him. And he was really on board and ended up being our champion. So it was important to find who is going to be your champion, who is going to, within Congress, represent you and talk on your behalf within Congress. So, and then we also went out to DC and met with them there as well. So, and a lot of groups like SEARAC and National Immigration project, they helped us like with these meetings. So inside these meetings, we made sure we had information to give to them, like information about the case, information about deportation among Southeast Asians, and then we had detailed information about the cases. Before they advocate for you, they need to know like all the details about the cases. And we had asked, so some of the things we asked were writing letters of support, writing public statements. They can make phone calls to DHS and to ICE to get making queries about the case. They can also make calls into USCIS about different things that you've filed. So there's things that Congress can do, and they can get it done a lot faster. It's like you can be on the phone with ICE or USCIS for hours waiting and keep calling them, but if a congressional leader reaches out to them, they usually get answers pretty quickly. And always keep in contact, keep following up. Even to this day, whatever progress or whatever things that are happening, we constantly inform them of what's going on to keep that communication.
Thank you so much, Eddie.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have anything else to add?
Nope, that's it.
Eddie, did you want to add anything too?
Yes, I feel that, you know, doing your homework ahead of time before reaching out to your local or national representative is very important. Having all the facts of the case, having the ask, you know, sometimes you can verbally ask them something, but it's very important to have something to leave behind to them. And normally everything is about relationship, right? So normally it's like if anyone in your network has any type of relationship with the representative, whether it's a congressperson or a senator or assemblyman in your own district, you know, normally, you know, it's easier to be able to arrange a meeting if you have a relationship. If you don't have a relationship, normally when you reach out to the offices of those representatives, you know, it's their aides, right? The aides who works for them, they are normally the direct link to their boss. So having a relationship with the aides or arranging a meeting with the aides to make sure to talk about those issues, so that way they will be able to relay the message. And also it's about constantly calling them, right? Constantly calling them and following up with them, because they are the representatives for you and for your district, so they have the responsibility to respond to you. So it's easier for you to be able to have access to them, right? And they have to respond to you. And so those are just ways that I was able to engage with different people through different relationships that we have. And sometimes the 6 degrees of separation that really rings true to the connection that people have that they may not know that they have. So that's why you have to do an inventory of your own network, see who's connected to who. And having national organization, again, to echo what Jenny was talking about, having national organizations who are already working with some of the representatives locally and nationally, then it would be better for them to already have existing relationships, so you don't have to create new relationships. So that's important.
Great, thank you so much, Eddie. Those are a lot of really helpful tips. So just to summarize kind of what Jenny and Eddie shared out, when you're doing outreach to your members, make sure to specifically request for whoever the immigration caseworker, if you're reaching out in district, trying to reach out to the specific immigration caseworker. Usually with these offices, there are a lot of staff there, and you want to make sure that you're speaking to the right person. With what a lot of people don't know is usually when you reach out to these offices, they can actually put inquiries on your behalf on a specific case with ICE. So just make sure that you're reaching out to the correct person. Another thing that both Jenny and Eddie touched on was coming to these meetings prepared. So it's not just a matter of scheduling a meeting and telling them your story, but you need to make sure that all that information is listed down on a sheet of paper that you could then leave behind with them. Often with these staffers, they're usually juggling a number of different things all at the same time. And you want to make sure that if they need details on your case, they'll have something to reference once you leave. So usually, if you could put together a short 1 to 2 pager that just outlines, a background of your immigration case, your criminal history if you have one, positive equities, which basically means talking about your contributions to your community, if you support U.S. citizen families, if you have rehabilitated since being incarcerated. And then the last 2 things, which are very, very important, are a list of concrete and actionable asks. So after you share your story, what action do you want this office to take? Do you want them to call ICE on your behalf? Do you want them to put an inquiry on your case? And if so, make sure to list that specifically on the 1-pager. And then lastly, of course, your contact information so they know who to follow up with. Another piece that most people don't know is when you try to outreach to these offices and say your ask is you want them to put an inquiry in ICE about your case, they usually make sure that you sign a privacy waiver, which basically says that the person who's detained is giving permission to share private information with their office. You'll see that on your panel, there's one handout there, which is a copy of the privacy waiver. So just make sure that you have that on hand as well. When I started doing advocacy, I would go into these meetings making all these asks, but then they would stall because they'd be like, well, where's your privacy waiver? And then that would take a long time of going back and forth once again. So as Eddie said, just making sure you do your homework ahead of time and coming prepared for these meetings. And then lastly, something that both of our speakers have emphasized throughout is making sure you follow up. These offices will do what they can to stall. They will not give you a concrete commitment. They will not give you a concrete answer. And it's basically up to you to basically hound them and bug them to get a yes. And once they say yes, making sure that they're actually doing what they promised to do. And at the end of the day, that remember that you are the constituent. You helped elect them into office, so they really should be accountable to you. So don't be afraid to follow up. So lastly, just to emphasize again, advocacy is just about consistent follow-up. All the 3 things that we talked about, these components should be happening simultaneously and informing one another. And this is really how you make long-term impact. And remember, as what our speakers were mentioning, under this administration especially, you're more likely to get a no before you get a yes. So it could definitely be very disheartening and exhausting. So make sure you gauge how far you're willing to go and make sure that you have a supportive network that is willing to fight alongside you as well. And just remember that advocacy takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of emotional, financial, and physical investment as well. So just making sure that you are definitely up to that challenge. So after talking about the components of advocacy, we also wanted to touch and give folks an honest analysis of the current political climate to help give families a gauge if advocacy at this point is right for them. Because depending on the situation, advocacy might not be the right way to go. So in terms of opportunities that advocacy could afford to you is one, you would really be contributing to a larger movement that shifts policies that allows for these mass detentions and deportations happening in the Southeast Asian American community. It will also give you the opportunity to uplift personal narratives that, as Jenny was mentioning, otherwise would be silenced. A lot of people, the public, don't know that these roundups and deportations are happening, and because of this, they don't know that it's unjust. And then lastly, in a small number of cases, in the case of Jenny, in the case of Eddie, they were able to successfully advocate for the release of the loved one or their own self from detention, or also delay or prevent detention altogether. So those are the opportunities that broadly advocacy would support. So next I want to hand it off to Anoop to also talk now a little bit about what the possible risks of speaking out would be, and also to talk a little bit about how do you know if speaking out is the right move for yourself or your loved one. Anoop?
Thanks, Katrina. So choosing to take part in public advocacy can be a really difficult decision at a really difficult point in the life of the person who's being impacted in their family. Generally, getting more personal stories of people impacted by deportations out there is helpful for the community, but individually, public attention can come with separate risks or sometimes even benefits. So some of the risks to consider when going public, first one is whether or not ICE might find some way to retaliate against the person. So a couple of ways that ICE could retaliate against someone is transferring them to another detention facility if they take part in advocacy, or if, for example, the country gives ICE a limited number of travel documents, prioritizing that person for deportation over other people. I don't have any personal experience with this happening, with ICE prioritizing people for deportation who take part in advocacy. I also don't have personal experience with transfers necessarily. One situation which we know there will be retaliation is if there's a hunger strike or other opposition inside the detention facility. ICE likely will retaliate by placing the person in solitary or doing other sort of punishment inside. The second thing to consider is, I think as Jenny and Eddie had both mentioned, is the process of doing media and speaking out publicly can be really emotionally draining and re-traumatizing. As they mentioned, a lot of reporters may not necessarily be entirely sympathetic. Some reporters who are otherwise sympathetic feel like they need to be unbiased and show both sides, and often will go through the details of criminal convictions. So a few suggestions for what might be helpful. One is you should feel completely free, even if you're doing public advocacy, to say no to some reporters. And there are a number of things you can consider in whether or not to actually talk to a reporter. You should probably research the reporter, see if they've covered immigration before, see if they've covered stories about incarceration before. If you feel like they may not necessarily be sympathetic, it's fine to say no. If Fox News calls, it probably makes sense to not take the interview because nothing positive is going to come out of it. So you should strategically pick the news outlets that you do talk to. I think we also mentioned that often what ends up being helpful for us is not waiting for good reporters to come to us, but we'll actually identify reporters at sympathetic outlets who have done good stories before on these issues, and we'll actually reach out to them and ask them if they're interested in covering this set of raids or this particular person's story. Another alternative is to use social media in case you are having difficulty getting positive media coverage. And one example of this is a campaign we just wrapped up for Nia Norn, a Cambodian domestic violence survivor facing deportation after serving a life sentence for a murder committed by her abuser. In the past, media attention had been really negative in her case. They had sort of demonized her and sensationalized her case. So we were really careful in picking which reporters we gave media access to, and otherwise used Twitter and Facebook to generate awareness around her case. Other suggestions might be identifying several people to serve as spokespersons so that the emotional burden is sort of spread out and isn't just focused on one person. Also, it's really difficult for reporters to talk directly to people in detention. Occasionally, I have given reporters access by having my client call the reporter from detention and do a call. But I've done that very sparingly and only when I have a really strong relationship with the reporter and really trust them to get the story right. But it is really powerful for people and reporters to hear directly from people inside. Some other factors to consider and whether or not to go public are, one, whether or not travel documents have already been issued. Once travel documents have been issued, there really isn't a downside to doing advocacy anymore. It's difficult to do very much once those travel documents have been issued, but also ICE can't really do anything to retaliate further. Other things to sort of think about when thinking whether to highlight a case are whether or not there are strong positive equities. And I think everyone has really strong positive equities, but it's important to think about how the media might characterize a story or what might end up being highlighted. So some things to think about to highlight when doing advocacy are whether there's an older conviction where you can show this narrative of rehabilitation, family ties, work history, evidence of community service. I think also it's important to sort of place a conviction into context and explain why it happened. If it happened because they were younger and where they were growing up, putting in the context of the refugee experience, but providing some sort of explanation as to, what led to the person's incarceration. Another thing that I tried doing when doing advocacy is to avoid throwing other people under the bus. So I try to avoid messaging that's this person is not X, this person doesn't have a violent conviction, or this person, isn't undocumented, they didn't come here illegally. Instead, focusing on what's positive about the person and not, contrasting them with someone else. It definitely is important to make sure that the person and their family just sort of have buy-in into doing public advocacy before you start and have a good idea of what it might entail. Once the story gets out there, it's often very hard to sort of walk it back and take the advocacy away and take the spotlight away. It's also really helpful to do advocacy if there's a legal strategy to allow the person to seek post-conviction relief or reopen their case. Even though ICE generally is not swayed by media coverage, an immigration judge or a criminal court judge, rehearing whether or not to resentence the person, or a district attorney very well might be swayed by media coverage, especially in local media coverage, and especially if there are elected officials that might have an impact on them. So it definitely helps media coverage when you have a legal strategy to support. So finally, I wanted to go over some options. If deportation isn't imminent, usually for Cambodia, it's several months between someone being picked up and actually getting a travel document. So looking into what some of those legal options are. And so the legal options vary a great deal depending on what state the conviction is out of, where the deportation order is out of, what the person's conviction is for. But generally, a few things that might be available for people. One is to reopen for something called a 212H waiver. This is something for a long time that was not available for people with aggravated felonies, but the law has changed over the past several years to make it available. And so for a 212H waiver, you need to have a U.S. citizen spouse or a U.S. citizen adult child. That's a son or a daughter who's over 21. Also, to qualify, you can't have any drug convictions or a conviction for murder or attempted murder. But if you fall into that, it might be possible to reopen so that you can apply for this waiver. Another thing that might be possible is many states have vehicles available to vacate a conviction or reduce a sentence. This varies a lot depending on the criminal law in the state where the person's conviction is out of. But sometimes this can change the immigration consequences of the conviction and allow a removal order to be reopened. But you should talk to someone who has experience with criminal law in the state where the person's conviction is out of. Also, the law has changed significantly in the past several years over what is considered an aggravated felony. So it might be possible to reopen a case based on one of these changes in law. And this ends up being really specific about specifically what statute the person was convicted of, which state the conviction was in, which federal circuit their removal orders from. But it's important to talk to an immigration lawyer and see if it might be possible to reopen based on a change in law. And then the last option is getting a full and complete pardon from the governor of the state of conviction. That's if it's a state conviction. If it's a federal conviction, you have to get a pardon from the president, and that's probably not going to happen. But most people have state convictions. And if you get a full and complete pardon from the governor, that erases the immigration consequences of the conviction and might allow it to be allow your order to be reopened. And that's what happened with Eddie. However, it is important to note that pardons are not effective for drug convictions and firearm convictions. So even if you get a pardon but you have a drug conviction, they're not going to reopen your deportation order, unfortunately. And so in the course of doing individual advocacy, it's also helpful to use that advocacy to support other people who are also fighting deportation, and also sort of link cases together like happened with the Minnesota 8.
Great, thank you so much, Anoop. So I apologize for folks who are running a little over time. We're going to open it up right now for Q&A. Folks can ask a question of either two ways. One way is you can chat and direct your questions to the organizers of the webinar, or you could raise your hand through the panel and we can unmute you if you're more comfortable asking your question over the phone. We have 2 questions right now. One is actually maybe for Anoop. This question is from Ratana Yang. He says, Bay Area news outlets in California have mentioned that hundreds of Southeast Asian families are impacted by this roundup. Oakland Unified School District is a sanctuary district and devoted to raising awareness and directing resources to families. We know of some families that are directly affected, but exactly how many is unclear. Does anyone on the ground know exactly how many Oakland families are impacted?
Hi, Ratna. Yeah, I know of some families that have Oakland ties. I don't know of anyone who's an Oakland resident who has picked up yet. Most of the people picked up, and they've been about 30 people from California picked up. Most of it from Stockton, Modesto, Fresno, Long Beach, Sacramento. But I don't know of any Oakland residents specifically who have been picked up yet.
Yeah, and I would echo what Anoop said. SEARAC's been doing some intake as well, and we don't have as many Oakland folks that have reached out to us at this point. So we're kind of unclear on the exact number, unfortunately. The next question is by Linda Sao, and it's actually a question Anoop already sort of answered, but she's asking, has there been cases where impacted individuals coming out to advocate has then become targets? And Anoop, I think you shared that you don't know specifically of this happening, is that right?
I know of retaliation for hunger strikes and other protests inside, but I don't know in terms of people being prioritized for deportation. But I mean, it may have happened, and I'm just not aware.
Right. And yeah, just to add on to what Anoop said, SEARAC has taken on a few individual cases as well. I mean, I won't say that it's been a huge number, but of the cases that we have worked on, I would say I've seen more positive results than negative. And I haven't seen ICE directly targeting families as well. However, I also want to make it clear that things might be different under this administration. So at this point, we're unfortunately not sure how that would go down. We have someone by the name of Tri Tai who raised her hand, and we're going to go ahead and unmute him or her. Tri, are you on the phone? Did you want to ask your question? Tree or Tree Tai?
If not,
okay.
We'll send a chat message.
If not, you can feel free to send your question via chat. We have another person who raised their hand, Sithea San. We're going to go ahead and unmute you right now if you want to ask your question. Are you there?
Yes. I have a question. If the a person that has been granted by the judge to stay in the U.S., not to deport it, is there possibility that he or she will deport to another country than the country that he was born?
Anoop, would you have an answer to that? Because I have something, but maybe you should start.
Yeah, sure. So looking
Can you repeat the question as well?
Yeah, so the question is, if the judge has granted relief from deportation to someone, is it possible that ICE could still deport them to another country? And so a couple of things are important to note. One is, I know a lot of people, especially in the Cambodian community, weren't born in Cambodia. They were born in Thai refugee camps. So Thailand does not recognize those people as being Thai citizens. So ICE generally cannot deport those people to Thailand. For some forms of relief, like Convention Against Torture or withholding of removal, it doesn't say that ICE can't deport you. It just says they can't deport you to a certain country, like they can't deport you to Cambodia. Generally, in practice, that means that there's nowhere else that they can be deported, and effectively they get to stay in the U.S. But it is possible for those forms of relief that ICE can try and find another country, but I haven't seen that happen with people from Cambodia or Vietnam.
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Anoop said. I haven't seen it happen to anyone from Vietnam or Cambodia as well. I do remember posing a question to this with like an ICE official when SEARAC had a meeting with one of their field officers. They basically said something around the lines of, you know, they just want to deport someone. They basically don't care what country to, but whatever country would be willing to accept them back, they would be open to deporting them. So I wouldn't put I wouldn't be surprised if this administration tried to deport people to other countries. But again, as Anoop said, I haven't been seeing a lot of cases or instances of that happening. For our next question, we have a question by Nate. He asks, for those who have early December check-ins, what is the best strategy to utilize so folks don't get detained again? Well, I don't know if folks want to add, but what we've just been informing folks to do at this point, unfortunately, is just try to secure an attorney, try to make sure that their case is screened for any forms of post-conviction relief, see if there's any legal form of relief to fight the possible detention, and making sure that they connect with a lawyer right away. And at this point, too, we've been informing families just to make sure to outreach to local organizations so they basically know what's happening to them. Some families have explored possibly asking community members to accompany them for their check-in, just to make sure that they have folks there kind of in solidarity. And if something does happen to them, that they make sure that there's a contact for their family, just to make sure that they kind of know what's going on and basically get their affairs in order just in case they do get detained. But those are some initial steps we've been telling family members. And at this point in time as well, since they haven't checked in, if they are open to reaching out to their congressional leader and kind of alerting them that they're about to check in, that might possibly help as well, especially if they are open to more public advocacy. And I don't know if speakers have anything to add to.
It is maybe worth mentioning what the, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just want to mention the consequences for not checking in. Generally, if you don't check in, the biggest impact is probably going to be, it's going to be difficult to renew your work permit. ICE can always come to your home to detain you there. But otherwise, not checking in doesn't generally lead to any sort of criminal penalties.
Eddie, did you want to add on too? Eddie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just saying that the people check in.
Eddie, you're breaking up. Can't hear you.
Checking in that somebody, either a lawyer is going with you or they're going with you. Mm-hmm. Expect that, that there's a normal check-in, and unless you are asked to report to have an unscheduled check-in, then the likelihood of you getting detained is greater. So prior to, I think that having a contingency plan is always important, just to understanding the current political climate. So know that, you will get detained. So get your personal affairs together while you keep fighting, so you won't get caught off guard and wait till the last minute to react.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. So folks, we're running out of time, unfortunately, and we have like 3 questions. So I'm going to try to ask them kind of back to back and package it. This one is for, well, these questions are kind of legal, so I'm just going to pitch it to Anoop. One question is, can you just briefly repeat what a 212H waiver or form is? And then also, well, actually, I guess we could start, for legal services, where can one find attorneys that can assist with these types of services? It seems that the list is limited and our attorneys listed are overly stretched. Did you want to tackle that real quick first, Anoop?
Yeah, sure. So for the 212H waiver, it might be possible to reopen, but so you need someone to petition you for a new green card. So that's going to be a U.S. citizen spouse or a adult child, so someone over 21 who's a U.S. citizen. And to qualify, you can waive most convictions, but you can't waive any drug convictions. So even if it's not charged by ICE, but you have a simple possession conviction, you can't waive that. And you also can't waive murder convictions or attempted murder. Legal resources, I know, are a challenge. There are a limited number of attorneys. You can try reaching out to legal aid organizations where you're living. ELC is happy to do consults with people over the phone who are going in for check-ins. I know we have been slow to respond to people, though, but you can try giving us a call at 415-896-1701 to talk to one of our immigration attorneys, and we will try and get back to everyone.
Great. And then this will be our last question. This is another legal question, Anoop. Has there been any recent experiences where a campaign is getting a detainee released without vacating the criminal charge?
So in terms of getting someone out because ICE just gives in, that hasn't been happening lately. As I mentioned, Nia Norn did get out of detention last Thursday. That was because of media advocacy. She was released in bond. But that was largely due to community pressure.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Anoop. In case folks have any follow-up questions, we're going to be sharing our emails at the end of the presentation, so feel free to reach out to us. We're going to be sharing a copy of this webinar as well, so there's just a few resources here that we are attaching. And again, just reiterating some phone numbers you guys can call for support if you or a loved one are in detention or about to face or about to check in. And also another plug for SEARAC's advocacy intake form if that's something you're interested in pursuing and need some support with. These are our email addresses. Please feel free to reach out to us for any questions. And again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to speak with us today, and especially want to thank our speakers. We hope to hear from you all, and thank you again for joining us today.